Was either monkey with a toy head. Understand. Samantha, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can just hear you now.
Okay, that's fantastic. Okay, now I need to go back to recording.
You're a little quiet, but I can hear you if I'm listening for you.
Okay, awesome. Is this better?
Yes.
When I'm not in like this whisper weird thing that I was doing a second ago, probably helps. That needs a raise. Unfortunately, that is outside of my powers. I know. I don't want to embiggen yet, though. Okay. Yeah. Of course. Okay.
I assume I'm waiting for you to like start a thing, right? You're not waiting on me.
No. I'm gonna our tech person had a different commitment for this evening, and I am working very hard.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that everybody's not just sitting there waiting for me to start talking.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so what I'm going to do really fast is do a quick intro, and then I will hand it over to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Hi. Hi. Welcome to the April Speaker Series at the Door County Maritime Museum. Obviously, you all know where you are. My name is Andrea Strohmeyer. I am what's my job? What do I do? Education. I do education. It's been a week. It's been a week for anybody else. Oh, God. What is going on this week? Anyway, I'm the Education Programs Coordinator here at the Door County Maritime Museum. And we would like to thank our sponsors, the Door County Medical Center and Bridgeport Resort. I did it. And Bridgeport Resort for helping us so much with the Speaker Series. Tonight, I am so excited about our speaker in this topic. We've got Samantha Engel. How do you pronounce your last name?
Engel.
Engel. Okay. Samantha Engel with the Great Lakes Lore podcast. Samantha is a Great Lakes historian. She's broadcasting to the museum tonight from Michigan, where she also teaches and researches history, including that of Dan Seavey. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Samantha to start the presentation.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be with you all virtually tonight, sharing a little bit about Dan Seavey. A little background about myself. I have a master's degree in history. I'm a Michigan native, born, raised, spent my entire life with the exception of 1 year here. And I am very interested in history. I work as the historian for a public garden here in Midland, Michigan. And because of that, I'm researching and studying and sharing local history all of the time. And so a friend and I decided to start the Great Lakes Lore podcast a couple of years ago. And we're not putting out any new episodes right now, but you can find the podcast still wherever you listen to podcasts and listen to some back episodes, because both of us enjoyed stories about legends and myths and supernatural tales and things like that from the Great Lakes region. But we're both historians, and so we don't just like taking these kinds of things at face value. We really want to dive into the history of a legend, look at the sources, dig through newspapers and census records and all of those things we like to do and not many other people often do. And, really kind of get to the heart of the legend and what may have influenced it and, what bits of fact we can find and what it tells us about today and the way that we think about the legend now. And so when Andrea sent us an email and asked if we'd want to do this presentation, I was very excited, and we tried to come up with a maritime topic, a bit of maritime Great Lakes lore. And I had never heard about pirates on the Great Lakes, but with a little digging, we did come up with Dan Seavey. And I thought that this could be potentially a fairly straightforward topic. You do a little Google searching, you find the facts about this gentleman's life, and, we'd probably find some fun newspapers, share the story, and we'd all have a good time. But I should have known better. The story of Dan Seavey is not very straightforward. And so I'm excited to sort of take you on this exploration of his life and talk a little bit about the way that historians do their work and how we might think about Dan Seavey now with all of the information that we have. So before we dive into his life, I thought we could all use a little geography lesson. I know I have some friends from Michigan who are tuning in, and while we are all of the Great Lakes region, it's still good to sort of refamiliarize ourselves perhaps with some of these places that are going to play a big part in tonight's tale. So Dan Seavey was active all over Lake Michigan. And so these are some of the places that come up the most regularly. So we're going to start with Milwaukee. Dan ends up settling there first when he moves to the Great Lakes region. He's originally from Maine, and we'll get into that in a few minutes here. Then the next place we need to travel is north of Green Bay, a bit north of where you folks are, up to Peshtigo. And this is where Dan Seavey is going to pass away. Spoiler alert, Dan Seavey passes away. But this is where he's going to pass away in 1949. And then if we head around the lake a little bit, we've got Escanaba up there, and that's going to be kind of a hub of Dan Seavey's exploits, and sort of that whole region right there that you see between the C and the D. We've got the Little Bay Dinock and the Big Bay Dinock that are those two bits of water right there, and then D is the Garden Peninsula, Fayette, which is today a state park, a Michigan state park, but at the time was quite the smelting operation, is there on the Garden Peninsula, and Dan Seavey spends a lot of time doing work and things in the Garden Peninsula. Then if we travel down the Lake Michigan shoreline, we come to Frankfort, and Frankfort will come up a few times. Down a bit further, we hit Grand Haven, and Dan Seavey gets into a bit of trouble in Grand Haven. And then you'll hear a little bit about Chicago. We all know where Chicago is, though, but I still felt like, since we'll be talking about it, I gotta give it a letter and put it on the map here. So I hope that providing you this map at the outset will help you kind of in your mind imagine the routes that Dan Seavey is taking and these places where he's spending a lot of his time. So when I start my research, I do what every historian does, and I go to Wikipedia. As I would tell my students, Wikipedia is certainly nothing you need to cite in your paper. You should never use that as a final source, but it is a really great place to start your research. You can kind of get your bearing with your topic, and then if it's a good Wikipedia page, at the bottom there will be a bunch of links to other sources that the authors of that page pulled from. And so if you go to Dan Seavey's Wikipedia page, you get a great look at what the legend of Dan Seavey is. And according to Wikipedia, Dan Seavey is a thief. He is stealing anything he can get his hands on. He will, slide into the docks of these various Lake Michigan marinas and steal basically anything that's not nailed down, disappear in the morning, and everybody knows Dan Seavey was here and he stole everything. He is perhaps a human trafficker. And we will get into that a little bit later. But one of the things he is said to have been stealing is women. He would pull into these places, Frankfurt, Grand Haven, Escanaba, wherever he's stopping. And as one article puts it that we'll see in a little bit, he would steal everything, including cattle, hay, and women. That's exactly how the article lists it. So ladies, you're welcome. We're there with the cattle and the hay. Dan Seavey is a murderer, as any good pirate probably ought to be. He's also a poacher. He was hunting a bunch of white-tailed deer and then taking the meat to various ports and selling it illegally. And one of my favorite terms that I learned while doing this research is that of a moon cusser or moon cussing. And that means that Dan Seavey would go to lighthouses, to these different, signal lights around the shoreline. He would disable them, and that would cause other ships to crash on the rocks. And then he and his crew would go in, steal everything they could, and head off to some other town to sell it. So probably, I would imagine if you are a sailor on the Great Lakes, moon cussing probably is like the lowliest of the low things that a person could be involved in. He's also a hijacker, stealing other ships. All in all, these things make Dan Seavey a pirate. And just to prove that, I included this interesting cartoon here. It comes from the website Our Detroit. I listed it there at the bottom. And they have a long article about Dan Seavey that's full of these really fun kind of comic book type illustrations of Dan's life. And I really enjoyed this one because he definitely has sort of a Captain Morgan pirate stance there, complete with the bottle of liquor in his hand. So this is what a cursory internet search will tell you about Dan Seavey. But is that true? Who actually is this guy? This is the only picture of Dan Seavey that you can find out there, really, with the exception of a much later in life picture. So you will be seeing this a lot through tonight's presentation. And based on this picture, I have already cast Daniel Craig to star in the movie about Dan Seavey's life. I think that's a very good actor choice there. And I would definitely, and I hope you will agree at the end, to watch a movie based on the life of Dan Seavey. Oops, oh gosh, I jumped to the end somehow. Forgive me. Let's get back here. Hold on, I'm very sorry about that. Okay, who was Dan Seavey? So according to an interview that he did in his 30s, he recounts his early life. And Dan Seavey was born in Portland, Maine in 1865. So 1865 is just after, the Civil War. So you can kind of ground yourself in that piece of American history. We're starting to deal with Reconstruction. We're a few decades out from a huge industrial revolution that's going to change American cities. And so Dan Seavey is kind of growing up at this time, and he will come of age during this time when cities like Chicago and Detroit and everything are really becoming industrialized. At the age of 13, Dan Seavey runs away from home and reportedly served on a series of tramp ships. Now, this is a term that, I think we've all heard in studying stories about maritime history, but I have an image of what a tramp ship is in my head, but I wondered what the actual definition of a tramp ship is. And it actually means that this is a ship that does not run according to any set itinerary. And so, it's not an official ship of a company, a big enterprise or anything that you can expect at certain ports at certain times. This is a ship, run by an individual that, comes into a harbor, picks up whatever's there to be shipped, heads off someplace, does the same thing at each place that it stops. So this is what Dan Seavey did for 5 years until he reached the age of 18 and ends up enlisting in the Navy. He served 32 months in the Navy, and then he got a job working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And according to him, he spent time in both Wisconsin and Oklahoma looking for smugglers and poachers on Indian reservations. And so I think this is kind of interesting that he starts off going after these smugglers and poachers and maybe learning a bit of the trade himself to take him into later life. So Dan Seavey then, since he's spending his time in Wisconsin working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, he decides that's where he would like to settle down once he is sort of done with that job. So sometime in the 1880s, he moves to Wisconsin. We can find him in the 1880 census, and he's still at home living, notes that he's living with his parents. That's the household that he is listed as being in, at least at the time that the census was taken. But he decides at some point after that to move to Wisconsin, and he marries a woman named Mary Plumley. And together the pair end up having 2 daughters. They live in Milwaukee, and according to 1896 business directories, he owns a couple of saloons. He's also involved in, the fishing business there. And through owning these saloons, he comes to know Frederick Pabst. And a couple of years after he settles down and, owns these saloons, gets to know Mr. Pabst a bit, Mr. Pabst gets him to sign on to a stake in the Klondike Gold Rush. So gold is found in the northern region, and Dan Seavey, as well as 9 other people all put up the money to have a 1/10 of a stake in a claim up there. So Dan Seavey sells all of his property in order to get these funds, in order to be part of this enterprise. And he ends up getting $14,000. He puts up $10,000 towards this claim and uses the other 4 probably to travel. And according to one Dan Seavey researcher, this is the first, quote, disappearing act that Dan Seavey pulls. Now, in my opinion, I think calling this a disappearing act, it's hard to say. He could have very well had a conversation with his wife and they agreed for him to do this. We don't have those records. I think that's using a bit of what we know Dan Seavey comes to do, reading a bit into his life that way. But he heads up to Alaska because he is going to be the one who is going to watch over that claim up there. And according to an interview that's done with him later in life, he says he loses all of his money. The only money that he actually makes is $500 from a saloon owner because they needed help getting a safe that had fallen down to the basement, fallen through the floorboards. They pay him to gather up some guys and help get it out of the basement. So that is the only money he claims to have made during the Klondike Gold Rush. Now, once he's done there in 1900, he returns back to Wisconsin, and it does kind of seem at this point he does pull a bit of a disappearing act because he ends up going to Wisconsin. Oh, I forgot. I included these couple of pictures here of the Klondike Gold Rush, just so you can get an image of it. I think a lot of us think of course, the California Gold Rush as, what the gold rush looks like. But when you're thinking about the Klondike Gold Rush, these are folks going into incredibly harsh territory. And that one picture that you see, the line of men that are just traveling up that snow-capped mountain, that kind of hard work is going to take a hard kind of a person to get up there. So I think that tells you a little bit about Dan Seavey's character and the type of individual that he is. He's worked on tramp ships, he owns some saloons, and then he heads off looking for gold. So Dan Seavey returns from the north, and he doesn't go back to Milwaukee, it seems, because he next turns up in Escanaba in 1900. And that's where he meets the Wanderer, which is the schooner here. And he purchases the Wanderer, and the Wanderer becomes sort of another major character in the life of Dan Seavey. These ships, when we think of these tales of maritime history, the ship is as much sort of a personage as the people of the stories are. And so the Wanderer definitely becomes that. And for the next, 10 or so years, the Wanderer is going to be sort of the thing that allows Dan Seavey to commit the various exploits that he will be committing. So I thought we should dive into those various exploits, and I chose a nice little pirate symbol right there for you all to enjoy because I couldn't help myself. But let's talk a little bit about what Dan Seavey was doing during this time. He was a known brawler. He would show up in towns and join in on fights to make some cash. The first story that we have of Dan Seavey getting involved in a fight like this is in Nobbin, and it's actually while he is working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So this is prior to all of these other things taking place. But it just shows sort of this pattern of behavior, I suppose. And so apparently he tracks down the smuggler in Nobbin, and the guy says that no man would ever be able to take him in hand-to-hand combat. And so Dan says, all right, let's see. And Dan apparently licks this guy. And at the end of the fight, he topples a piano over on top of him. And he sends a telegram back saying outlaw expired while resisting arrest, because this man, while he was alive, once medical attention got to him, he passed away shortly thereafter. And outlaw expired while resisting arrest, I think is, it seems very Dan Seavey, and I think you'll agree with me. Later on, he ends up showing up in Manistee, where there's this sort of up and coming prize fighter who seems to be, beating everybody who attempts to fight him. So Dan, he's a big guy. He's described as being well over 6 feet tall, barrel chested. He has a slim waist. He's very fit. Women describe him as very handsome. You saw the picture of him. I'll let you make that determination on your own. But he shows up in Manistee. He challenges this guy, and again, just decimates him, and he takes the prize money and skedaddles out of there before the authorities could show up, and he could get in trouble for all of the damage he caused in this tavern in which the fight took place. Dan then later in 1904, he actually engaged with a very famous prize fighter from the southern part of the state named Mitch Love. The pair met in Frankfurt. It was winter, and apparently the fight took place on the ice of the harbor. And once again, Dan won. According to the report, he beat Mitch Love to a pulp. He collected the prize money, and he had the rest of his crew out making side bets as well. So together they all were able, Dan knew how to get the top winnings, I should say. And so they together all made quite a bit of money on this particular endeavor. So he was definitely known for being the tough guy, engaging in a battle of fisticuffs, if you will. Now, one thing that Dan is accused of and apparently admitted to is operating a floating bordello on the Wanderer. So one thing to keep in mind is that while there were laws, dictating what happened on land in these towns where he was stopping, those authorities had no authority once you were on the water. So Dan could get a bunch of, sex workers onto his boat, go to these different towns, pick up the guys, and quickly head back off to sea and operate that. The question, though, becomes, and this is where I think that human trafficking claim comes in, whether or not he was kidnapping women and putting them on the ship, which seems to be alluded to in this article we have here, where it says Dan used to slip into ports at night, stealing everything loose on the docks, cattle, hay, and women. And so if that's the case, that is a very, very, very bad thing. But later, Dan Seavey admits in the 1940s, which this is just a few years prior to him passing away, that he did operate this floating bordello on the Wanderer. Of course, Dan Seavey seems to be his own PR man, though. He had a reputation that he wanted to create and craft, and I think we'll see that throughout the presentation. And so whether or not he's playing into that, or this was really a thing that he did, you can't really find true articles about this in the newspapers that are available. I tried looking and nothing was popping up. So it could have happened. It could not have happened. There were no, articles saying wanted Dan Seavey and the Wanderer for committing this crime. Nothing was out there, but definitely a widely known charge at the time and later on remembered. The other thing, which I think is very, very plausible that Dan was up to, was poaching and the venison trade. So throughout the 19th century, the white-tailed deer population in the United States was declining, especially throughout the first half. As people moved from cities further out into the wilderness, developing land, cutting down trees, forest fires often followed, intense logging operations. This, as well as just unchecked hunting for sport, for meat, for, the hides to make leather goods, whatever it was, really took a toll on the deer population. And so by the middle of the 1800s, states began enacting laws to govern the hunting of white-tailed deer. And so this venison trade definitely became an illegal thing as people just continued hunting willy-nilly as they would. And if you can imagine, we all know here in this region that this is a place where the white-tailed deer population thrives. And so then if along Lake Michigan you have, especially cities like Chicago, where there are lots of people who don't necessarily have access to meat or something, if Dan could take a boat up to northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, up to the UP, wherever it was, hunt a bunch of deer, take the venison down to Chicago or other cities and sell that, and perhaps sell it for cheaper than, say, the butchers are selling other meats. He probably could have made a lot of money doing this, and this was a very common problem in this region at the time. Now, there is one story associated with this that I really don't think happened. There are a couple of mentions of this. You can find this on the Wikipedia page, as well as an article from the 1970s remembering Dan Seavey's life. And it mentions that the Booth Fisheries Company, which operated out of Chicago, wanted to sort of horn in on Dan Seavey's venison trade. And so they tried to run him off, whatever they're running him off of. This is literally the only report of this incident that I could find. They try running him off, and Dan Seavey ends up getting a cannon, mounting it on the Wanderer, chasing back after these folks, firing on them, and killing everybody aboard. And now you would think if this was a thing that actually happened, it would be all over the Chicago newspapers, especially these big newspapers that are definitely digitized and available to us today. But I can't find any record of it at all. So how the story evolved, where it came from, it's so hard to tell. Perhaps it's a story that Dan Seavey shared up at a bar in Escanaba or something, trying to talk up his own abilities, his own strength, the feats that he accomplished. It's really hard to say. But this was a story that, again, right on the Wikipedia page, but I just can't find the facts to back it up. And there were other folks who were probably interested in the things that Dan Seavey were bringing to port. So this is a photograph of a group of men working in Fayette. So that, again, is on the Garden Peninsula up there in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And this was a large smelting operation up there. And so there were lots of guys working here, or you imagine all of the guys working at lumber camps or different things, trying to make a living out of the untamed wilderness of the northern Michigan, Wisconsin region. If Dan comes up with a boat full of venison, sometimes fruits, he was transporting fruits. So that could be something they were interested in, but just different foods that they don't have access to, or a boat full of women. I suppose that there's probably a lot of these guys who are very interested in the goods that Dan could potentially be bringing to port for them. Now, there is one case that was highly documented at the time, and this is what I like to call Dan's chase on the high seas. And so this takes place in starts in Grand Haven, takes place all over Lake Michigan, but it starts in Grand Haven. In June of 1908, Captain Robert J. McCormick reports that his ship, the Nellie Johnson, has been stolen by Dan Seavey. And this ship had a full a hold full of lumber, and Dan's then spotted in Chicago. The idea that being that he was taking it there to sell the product that was on the ship and take the money for himself. So the U.S. Marshal Thomas Currier boards the U.S. cutter, the Tuscarora, and the captain of the Tuscarora with the marshal on deck start a chase up the Michigan shore. Dan leaves Chicago, heads up the West Michigan shore there, and U.S. Marshal Currier is after him. On June 19th, Seavey is spotted in Frankfurt. He's actually offshore. He's back on the Wanderer. So he was not on his schooner during, the first part of this. He's on the Nellie Johnson. Up in Frankfurt, then he's back on the Wanderer. Everybody reports that they see him. And so the Tuscarora, which is larger, it's steam powered, it hustles up there and gives chase. And according to one newspaper report, I enjoyed the way they reported this. It said, with only 500 yards between the boats, the cutter flew a government signal calling on the sailor to heave to. The signal was disregarded. So then the cutter apparently opens fire on Seavey, and Seavey surrenders. Marshal Currier, who has a warrant for his arrest, takes Seavey to Chicago in irons. And that just sounds so very piratey, I think. This newspaper article from a specific maritime newspaper out of Chicago really played up sort of this high seas piratey drama of it all. And this is where the idea that Dan Seavey is the only man charged with piracy on the Great Lakes comes about. And one article that I read really explains this very well, that a lot of people say that the warrant that the marshal had was for piracy, but that warrant we cannot find anymore. Nobody knows where the warrant is. And what Dan Seavey actually ends up being charged with is mutiny and sedition. So for taking over a ship that he was not in command of, that's what the actual charge is. And he doesn't actually end up serving any time for it. He is in prison. He's awaiting indictment, and he is never indicted. And people really speculate as to why that could be, whether there wasn't enough evidence of him actually doing the bad thing and stealing it. We'll get into that in just a second. Some people wonder if Dan Seavey had some friends in high places. Perhaps some judges in Chicago were really interested in the venison he was bringing in, or maybe some of the other things he was bringing in on the Wanderer, if you get my drift. But it's hard to say. Some people say that Captain McCormick actually never showed up to court as he was supposed to testify against him. Why wouldn't he have? Nobody knows. But the Nellie Johnson at the time was found anchored in the Frankfurt harbor, and she had water in her hold, and she was still full of lumber. Apparently, people say that Dan could not sell the lumber down in Chicago. Perhaps he didn't have enough time, who knows, but she was still full of the product that she had set out with. And I just included this here. This is a copy of the letter that the captain of the Tuscarora sent to the Secretary of the Treasury, saying that they had captured Dan Seavey, and that he was found on the schooner Wanderer. So here's where things get a little messy with this story. So this is the one story that we can find all of this evidence that really happened, but we still aren't sure exactly what happened, because legend says, and what you'll find if you just do a very quick and brief Google search without digging into it, is that Dan got the crew of the Nellie Johnson drunk in Grand Haven and threw the captain overboard and stole the ship. That's the very popular recounting of what happened. The newspapers say that Dan stole the ship, but as I mentioned, he wasn't actually charged with piracy at all, and he wasn't convicted. What Dan says is he was on the Nellie Johnson, and again, we don't know why he was on the Nellie Johnson to start with, but he was on the Nellie Johnson, and McCormick, when they docked in Grand Haven, McCormick left the ship and disappeared for a couple of days. He didn't come back. And Dan said, McCormick didn't come back. The Nellie Johnson was in bad shape. She needed repairs that he wasn't attending to. So I was trying to do the right thing by taking the ship and getting her taken care of and getting the load of cargo where it needed to be. Now, I don't know if that's what your intentions were, why you would then run. But again, it's really hard to parse out what was going on here, because why didn't Robert McCormick show up to the courts in Chicago? Maybe he was just busy and thought, whatever, I got my ship back, it's all good. It's hard to know. History is full of these little details that you just need to fill in the complete picture of a story. So what happens after this? This is kind of the end of the heyday of Dan Seavey's exploits. You don't find much else in the newspapers about anything else that was going on. Of course, there are probably still rumors that he was operating, committing nefarious acts while aboard the Wanderer. But at some point after 1910, shortly after 1910, the Wanderer was wrecked off the shore of Burnt Bluff, and Burnt Bluff again is up on the Garden Peninsula. It's a bit south of Fayette. He then acquired a new schooner, the James Hall, and that was lost in 1916 in Thunder Bay. Seavey continued after that, running waters, kind of making deliveries, like more on the up and up type things, it seems. And he was using a 45-foot power craft called Alice. And so that was the last boat that Dan Seavey owned that he really was doing a bunch with on Lake Michigan, on the lakes. Most accounts of Dan Seavey have him retiring in 1927. And you'll also find that he ends up, it's claimed that he ended up working as a U.S. Marshal, tracking down smugglers on the Great Lakes after this, after all of his exploits. So he apparently pulls a sort of catch me if you can situation, if you watch that Tom Hanks movie that came out. Probably longer ago than I like to realize it came out. And so he actually, sort of turned tables and was working for the government. He, of course, would have had the best knowledge on how to track these people down. And he was kind of returning to, one of his first jobs when he was working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Dan Seavey ends up passing away in 1949. So after retirement, after he's done working as a U.S. Marshal, he apparently makes up with one of his daughters. Her name was Josephine, and that was the daughter that he had with his wife, Mary Plumley. And he lives with her up in the Upper Peninsula and northern Wisconsin area, a couple locations for a while. And then he ends up in a convalescent home in Peshtigo, and that's where he ends up passing away in 1949. And a long obituary is run in the Escanaba Daily Press, and we get a kind of a different look at Dan's life. This article really doesn't mention his outrageous exploits. We don't hear much about floating bordellos or blowing up the Booth fishery ship or anything like that. We get some background from his life. The obituary includes an interview with Dan that was taken in the 1930s. And so that's where we get those bits about him, running away from home at 13, working on the tramp ships and that kind of thing. But then he kind of waxes poetic about the time that he spent sailing the Great Lakes. According to him, he actually even helped transport some university professors and scholars around who were doing research on sort of indigenous tribes, or as they called it at that time, the prehistory of the region. And one in particular was a professor from the University of Missouri who wanted to go up to the Nipigon River, which is in Canada and empties out down into Lake Superior. And there's a bunch of petroglyphs and different things that have been found in that area. And so this professor wanted to research that, and Dan took him up there. So, escorting and sailing these professors and scholars around the Great Lakes sounds very different from some of the stories that, we just talked about. So again, you get that different look on the life that he was living. So that begs the question then, all of this, was Dan Seavey a pirate? So here we have the official definition of a pirate according to the United States legal codes. So a pirate is a person committing any illegal acts of violence or detention or any act of depredation committed for private ends by the crew or the passengers of a private ship or aircraft today on the high seas against another ship or aircraft. And so by this definition, if all of the things about Dan Seavey are true, he certainly, I think, could probably be called a pirate. But I think, as we'll talk about in just a second, that might paint a bit of a narrow picture of him. But these exploits and this idea of Dan Seavey being, the only man charged with piracy on the Great Lakes has given him a bit of a role in pop culture. So as I was doing my research, I came across 2 different television series who featured Dan Seavey in one of their episodes. Up in the right-hand corner, we have Warehouse 13, which was a sci-fi television series. In it, this team of agents, government agents, try looking for artifacts that have kind of supernatural powers about them. And one of the things that they're looking for is, something that Dan Seavey had stolen. It was some puzzle box of Dan Seavey's. And they have Dan Seavey pitched as being a Great Lakes pirate off the coast of Maine, or I'm sorry, an Atlantic Ocean pirate off the coast of Maine. So, they get the Maine part right, but definitely not where Dan Seavey was operating. And so he's not actually in the episode because the episode takes place in the present time, but he's the subject of this episode. Down in the lower left-hand corner, though, is a picture of an episode of the Murdoch Mysteries, which is a Canadian TV show and sort of a period crime procedural, if you will. And one of their episodes focuses on Dan Seavey, and I'll give you one guess as to which gentleman in that picture Dan Seavey is supposed to be. I think they do a fairly decent job at getting his likeness to that one picture of him correct. But in it, Dan Seavey is the bad guy of the week that they are trying to track down. He is a Great Lakes pirate, so they at least get that part right. And they're tracking him down in this episode. And then Dan Seavey has also become the spokesperson for Great Lakes Distillery rum. Of course, he's a pirate, so it has to be rum. But you can see his image there on their bottle right there. And Great Lakes Distillery is out of Milwaukee. So this idea of Dan Seavey as pirate, again, if you do the quick Google search, you find the easy answer. You see he's a pirate and you're like, great, there's the subject for this week's episode of Murdoch Mysteries. Oop. So then there's one other newspaper article that I think is interesting and again gets to this other side of Dan Seavey. So this was an article that ran in the 1970s in the Benton Harbor Herald Palladium, and that's where I pulled also the Booth Fishery story and that lovely phrase about Dan Seavey stealing the cows, hay, and women. So in this article, though, the headline is actually Old Timers Recall Exploits of Lake Pirate. And we do have another picture of Dan Seavey here. This is obviously a much older picture of Dan. And in this, we have some interesting memories from people. A lot of them were, children while Dan Seavey was, coming to dock in Escanaba. And so, they remember how they, quote, used to rush to the dock when Captain Dan was in town. We'd rig up a dart with horseshoe nail and chicken feathers and spear the apples in Dan's boat, pulling them up with a string. So they were stealing the fruit that Dan was bringing into the Escanaba Harbor. And Dan apparently caught them once and he growled, "Now, boys," Dan said in his down east twang, "you just listen. You can have all the apples you want, but don't swipe them." So, he did not get the boys in trouble, but just tried to teach them a nice lesson. And then, of course, because these young boys would hear that pirate Dan Seavey, Captain Dan Seavey, whatever he'd been up to, had come into the harbor. And so they'd run out, they'd see his boat and sit down and listen to all the stories that he told. And apparently one young boy had gotten in trouble by his parents several times and was finally told, you are not to go out and listen to Dan Seavey anymore. And the father caught him doing this again and gave the boy a spanking. And according to this memory in the newspaper article, it says, suddenly a heavy hand fell on the father's shoulder. He was whirled around, turned bottom side up as Dan proceeded to administer a spanking to the Escanaba businessman. That'll teach you to leave my shipmates alone, growled the captain. So looking out for the little admirers, it seems. And that story I actually found in another article as well. But as I mentioned earlier, it seems as though Captain Dan was the master of his own persona. I mean, I suppose we all are, but he created the image that he wanted people to know him by. And so this article also says that Captain Seavey had a large flour sack that he had filled with skulls that he had dug up from a burial ground of the wilds of the north, the article said. And he would carry this bag into the bars with him. He'd pull these skulls out and sit them on the bar stool next to him, or next to the others, and they'd turn around and get quite a fright. And one woman even said, oh, I thanked Dan for doing that because my husband never went back to the bar again. But of course, you're going to talk about a man who, comes around with a sack full of skulls, if he was in fact doing that. And you're going to have a certain kind of image of this person, and you're going to come up with stories about him. He comes to town every once in a while. We've heard some stories. Then he has the sack full of skulls. You're going to assume he's up to no good, I think. And then finally, I enjoyed this quote. It said, a man of courage, ready for a fight with anyone who would dare take him on. Seavey would sail in any kind of weather. His was the last schooner in at Escanaba in the late winter, riding heavy seas full sail, the bow ice covered and the spars white with snow. Seavey's call for a round of drinks brought every man to the bar. Those who hesitated felt his big hand on their collar and his boot on their pants. So again, quite the tough guy. He even, sailed on the lakes during the winter and, could put up with tougher weather than anybody else could. So all of this together, stories from the kids, the other possibilities of the things that he was up to, these things that we've discussed tonight. I think all of this begs the question as to what Dan Seavey we walk away with tonight. We have the Dan Seavey on the left, this gnarled hand, crazed looking sailor who's trying to outrun, the U.S. cutter ship back there, the Tuscarora. That looks like a crazy pirate. Or do we have somebody a little more complex? The Dan Seavey, the one picture we have of Dan Seavey there on the right. And I think the thoughts that I want to leave you with are that, humans are complex. And this is what I try to share when I'm, at my day job, talking about the folks who lived at the site in which I give tours and do programs with. We have these ideas of who they are, but they are complex people just like you and I are. And especially with legends, they so often whittle people down. And these stories, they whittle them down to stories that are easy to tell, I guess is what I'm trying to say. They become a two-dimensional thing. And so Dan Seavey, I think, if you just take him at face value or just take him as some of these stories, posit as possibilities, you get much more of a character than a man. He's the criminal of the week instead of a man that possibly made up with his daughter at the end of his life. And, maybe he did a little bit of good. There's a story that there was a young man in Escanaba and he had, sort of made up his own little rig, a little schooner. And Dan said, I don't like the look of your rigging there. And so he went over and helped the kid. So, and again, at the end, he ends up, working for the U.S. Marshals too. So the other thing that I think legends don't do is they don't leave us room for change. They sort of lock a person or a story or an event into this one moment in time, and they don't really give room for that person or that thing to evolve. And so, of course, the same way that we evolve, perhaps Dan Seavey evolved too. So are you going to take Dan Seavey as the pirate or as the whole person? And that is the end.
much, Samantha. Okay, so show of hands, who thinks of Dan as this like gnarly cartoon character on the left? Okay, and who thinks of Dan as this like kind of sly looking dude who's got a little bit of a complex history? You're really unsure and you kind of wish you were there to sort of see. That's me. I really wish I was there to see what all that is about. Okay.
Oh, I know. I still have a list of questions and things that I want to keep looking into and exploring. You know, I went from really not knowing much about Dan Seavey to thinking, well, I think I could spend the rest of my life traveling to tiny little libraries and looking through their microfilm newspapers and things, trying to see, you know, what other sources they might have to shed more light on his life.
Yeah. I think we kind of take a solo trip, like, and follow his route and see if we can find any like gold or treasure or something somewhere. Like, get out on the sailboat with like a metal detector and be that crazy person on the high lakes. Okay, so how we'll do this is if you have a question, raise your hand, and then you can either come up here and speak to Samantha, or I will repeat your question.
Yeah, it looks like Brian, you have a question there.
I do. I'm wondering if you or anyone else that you know of has done any genealogical work on his descendants. If he had two daughters, there must, because the records would have gotten better by then, would there be any evidence of, again, his descendants who are around now, or people who might have heard stories of him?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great route to take. I started playing around on Family Search a little bit to see what I could find. And, you know, that's where we can, you know, we follow the censuses. And so there were a few different censuses where later in his life, Dan is living with his daughter. I read that after he left his first wife, Mary Plumley, you know, they had two daughters. She actually ends up remarrying. And according to one article I read, she had a large family that she raised. But then there are rumors that the two of them got back together at the end. That she had an alias of Mary Silver, and together Mary Silver owned a plot of land with a John Silver. And so someone speculated, like, what if Dan was, you know, using the code name John Silver, like in Treasure Island, Long John Silver. And that just felt like a mess that I did not have the capacity to unravel at this time. But no, I think that's a really great idea. He ends up marrying in Escanaba a woman named Zilda Bisner, I believe, and they're married for about 4 years before she files for divorce, but they end up having 2 children together. And then he marries again. And according to one thing I read, they were married for quite some time, although it doesn't appear that they had any children. But that would definitely be one route to take to potentially track down even some maybe family oral history stories or something like that. Definitely worth diving into for sure.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. Good,
yeah, no,
very
thank you
good
for the
presentation.
question.
Very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and Peggy, you have a question?
Well, a question and kind of a comment. I purchased a house 14 years ago and lived here for quite some time. And when I married my husband, who's a retired freighter captain, the local historical society here in Escanaba notified me that Dan Seavey lived in the house that we live in.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and she's our neighbor, Karen Lindquist from the Delta County Historical Society. So I've done a lot of research on Dan Seavey, and I would love to talk to you sometime because I can fill in some of your blanks too. And also a longtime family friend who's 90 years old who lives in Green Bay, her dad owned the fishery where he used to bring fish in. And she actually met Dan Seavey several times, and she talked about his massive hands.
I read that in an article. People were obsessed with his hands.
And that's the first thing she told me about him. But he did have, his son Earl that was born here died at 5.
Oh,
and
okay.
But I've researched his girls didn't have children.
Okay. All right. I had not dug into whether or not the daughters had any children or not.
We'll have to get together and put some pieces together because
yes, no, I'd love to get your contact info.
Ton of information. Yeah. Andrea knows we did the presentation in February at the Maritime. So she's got all of our stuff.
Okay, great. I'll make sure she connects us then.
Yep, we can get together.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, anybody live in person have a question for Samantha? Nope. Are we
Where
sure?
is he buried?
Oh yeah, where is he buried?
Oh, I didn't write that down. But you can find it. I'm so sorry, I don't have that off the top of my head.
Marinette.
It's if you can find him on Find a Grave. I found it there. Hold on, I could probably very quickly look this up on my phone. I did not write it down.
I think you said Marinette.
That sounds familiar to me.
We've heard Peshtigo and Marinette, but the one I hear the most is Marinette.
So this says Forest Home Cemetery in Marinette. That's what Find a Grave says, and it has a picture of his marker.
Oh wow, very interesting. All right, well, Samantha, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes,
tonight.
thank you.
Everybody online, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you all so much for coming out in person. Samantha talked early on in her presentation about how it was Captain Pabst that talked Dan Seavey into going out for the Klondike Gold Rush. And that is the topic of our May Speaker Series, Captain Pabst. So come back Thursday, May, I think it's the 5th, but I don't know for sure. Calendars will know better than I will. Safe travels, everybody. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. It was really great. I know I can't see most of your faces, but you know, it was really fun researching. So I'm glad to have had the excuse to dive into a subject like this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, hi, Megan. And then somebody really quickly jumped in on Zoom and said, was the Wanderer ever salvaged?
So I read somewhere that you can still find, or people claim to be able to see bits of the wreck out there. But I don't remember what article I read that in and how long ago that was published. And so I'm not sure if that would be current whatsoever. I haven't been up in that area in a number of years myself. So
I think this calls for a road trip.
I think so, yes.
I think we should do it as a museum team building
Yes.
trip. What do you think, Megan?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm all for that.
We Airbnb the house so you can come stay in his house, and then we'll go up to Gooley Bay and go check it out.
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing.
That would be so fun. That would be so much fun. All right, I am going to end this presentation. Thank you all so much for joining again. Thank you so much, Samantha.
Okay, yes, thank you so much, Andrea. Bye.